What's up guys, welcome back to another GGF video, and today we'll be taking a look at the brand new O11 Mini from Lian Li. Now this case has been in the works for quite a while now. I remember seeing this at CES 2019, which was nearly 2 years ago. So this is going to be a pretty big video, and I do want to make one thing clear that Lian Li has done a really good reviewer's guide. I could probably tell you now, you could probably review this chassis quite in depth going by their review guide without even needing the case in your hands. But I wanted to bring this up because I do cover a lot of measurements of this case, GPU clearances, radiator fitment and so on. They do differ slightly than what is in the reviewer's guide. I just wanted to point that out, as if you see another review somewhere else that my measurements are different. I've taken all my measurements again. I haven't really looked at their measurements. The thing with the measurements that Lian Li have provided for radiator fitment and so on, they pretty much stop at the motherboard. So at the top of the chassis, that's not so bad, too bad, because you are pretty much limited to the top of the motherboard anyway. But at the bottom of the motherboard, especially for an ATX motherboard, Lian Li has stated in some cases that you only have about 20 millimeters of space, but I have confirmed that you can fit thick radiators that go up past the motherboard, and we have seen this in like the cases like the original O11 and the O11 XL, where you can fit quite large 60 millimeter thick radiators, providing you're only using one GPU and no other slots. You can actually run them up past the motherboard. So I just wanted to point that out for that. But yeah, anyway, let's jump in. I won't keep you waiting any longer, so let's check it out. One of the most anticipated cases of recent times is just about here, and after the success of the O11, Lian Li have not held back with the O11 Mini. For those of you that haven't been following Lian Li and their O11 Mini content, to put it quickly, the Mini is basically a smaller O11. Now I didn't say cut down because that just wouldn't be right. The O11 Mini still has a host of features, for example, unique modular back panels for specific motherboard sizes, a dedicated vertical GPU back panel, triple radiator support and more. So sit back, grab some snacks, as this video is going to be a long one. First off, and as I always do, let's take a look at the chassis exterior, and you can clearly see Lian Li has kept that O11 shape with that front and side tempered glass design that everyone loves to show off their hardware. The Mini comes in two colors, black or white, with the white version having a brushed silver aluminum fascia at the front. Case dimensions come in at 380 high, 434 deep and 270 wide, and weighing 8.5 kilograms. Up against its predecessors, the XL and the original O11, we get a good idea of the Mini's overall size. I'm also very happy that Lian Li has slightly altered the paint used for their white version. You can clearly see the Mini has no pinkish tinge to it like before. Chassis materials include 0.8mm steel for the body, 1mm steel for the interior and back panel, 4mm thick tempered glass, and 2mm aluminum for the top and right panels. Just a note, and just like on the XL, the top and right side panels on the black model are brushed aluminum, and on the white model they are painted white. A magnetic dust filter can be found at the top, two on the right side panel, and a slide out one at the bottom, similar to the O11 XL. Front I/O has now been moved to the top of the chassis for a cleaner look, which includes a power button with a built-in blue power LED, audio combo port, USB Type-C, and two USB 3.0 Type-A ports. On the black model, the I/O is now surrounded by an acrylic strip at the top with the brushed aluminum behind. This is also the same for the front of the chassis. This gives off a nice stealthy look on the black version, while the white version is just aluminum at the top. Jumping onto the inside, and probably what you've all been waiting to see, an exploded diagram just shows you how many different parts are included with the Mini, and just one part here is an optional extra, the vertical GPU mount, which I'll be checking out later. For motherboard support, and this is where things get real tasty, here we find ATX, MATX and MITX support with the chassis' default form, but the Mini comes supplied with removable rear PCI modules. In the case's default setup, and this is how it's shipped, all PCI modules are installed, giving you 7 slots. This is required for an ATX motherboard. You can still use this configuration for MATX or MITX, but you really aren't utilizing the whole case. For the preferred MATX layout 5 slot, you simply remove one PCI module, slide the back panel down while adding a mesh blanking plate in the gap up the top. This now drops the motherboard down for better radiator and fan support. I'll cover radiator support for all the different configurations later on. For the preferred MITX layout 3 slot, you simply remove another PCI module, slide the panel further down and add another mesh blanking plate up the top. This now pretty much centers the motherboard directly in the chassis for some crazy radiator options. If going with the ATX layout, you should install the supplied ATX MATX extension bracket. This does cause these two motherboard form factors to slightly extend over the cable routing holes. With ATX or MATX motherboards, I had no issues installing 240 or 280mm AIOs on the side or an EK-PE240. With a standard ATX 244mm wide motherboard, I had 164mm between the motherboard and the front of the case, or 33mm of space between the motherboard and an EK-PE240 radiator. I even tried an EATX motherboard, and although it does fit, I was unable to install an all-in-one cooler or an EK-PE240 on the side. The Mini really isn't designed for large boards like this. Plenty of cable routing can be found along the right side of the motherboard in traditional O11 style. More than enough room here for GPU cables, 24-pin and other required cables. More cable cutouts can be found at the top for EPS and other cables, while a heap of cutouts can be found at mid and bottom motherboard tray. These are required for all the different motherboard configurations possible. Just a note, if you're wanting to use the top two rows for large bulky cables, the hard drive cages will need to be removed. Small cables should be able to squeeze in between. One nice touch are the little labels next to each motherboard standoff, detailing which ones are required for which layout you have gone with. GPU clearance is up to 395mm to the front of the case. As most GPUs will stick out past the side radiator location, there is 61mm of clearance behind the GPU. Here I was able to fit a crazy EK-XE240mm radiator with fans in the rear chamber. For those wanting to go with a thick radiator and fans in the main section, there is 277mm for GPU length before hitting the EK-XE240mm radiator. Shorter water-cooled GPUs like the RTX 30 series actually don't go past the side radiator location. Up to 172mm wide GPUs can fit in the Mini, which is the same GPU width support as in the O11 XL. This I'm really happy to see and glad it wasn't the same as on the original O11. CPU cooler height is up to 170mm. Moving around the back, and Lian Li have once again included the cable management bar, which can support two 2.5-inch SSDs. Mechanical storage can be found the same way, just like on the O11 XL, with two slide-out bays, although this time they are not hot swap. These can either take two 3.5-inch hard drives or two 2.5-inch SSDs, but unlike on the XL, this cage can only be mounted to the bottom location, but is removable if needed. PSU support is SFX or SFXL and can only be mounted above the hard drive cage up the top. Due to the case's size, there is no way to allow for ATX power supply support. Although there is no official support to run dual PSUs, two will fit. You'll just need to add some extra holes. Currently, SFX units are limited to around 800 watt, so stay tuned for my O11 MATX build as it will require over 1000 watts. Before taking a look at radiator fitment, Lian Li does offer an optional vertical GPU mount. Now this thing is pretty crazy. The mount is actually the whole back panel of the chassis and replaces the back panel that comes installed in the case. The vertical GPU bracket has two mounting options. At its highest option, and this is the only option for ATX layout, allows for 60mm under for radiator and fans, while in its second position MATX or ITX only, the spacer is now at the top and the vertical GPU bracket is slightly lower, allowing for 23mm under, which will fit slim fans only. I was very happy with GPU sag, and as you can see, there was really none at all. The bracket was also very rigid as well. The vertical bracket has 3 GPU slot locations, but with a double slot IO card really gives you 2 options. In the closest position to the motherboard, I had 120mm of clearance between the GPU and side radiator location. The vertical GPU bracket can also take GPUs with a 3-slot IO bracket. It is PCIe Gen 4 ready, but unfortunately I have no price on this yet. And yes, these come in either black or white depending on which O11 Mini you have chosen. Nice. For all-in-one coolers, I had no issues fitting up to 280mm AIOs or 280mm radiators in the side section with ATX motherboards installed. This is really the only option here, as the top has just 30mm of clearance in the 7-slot layout. The bottom can be used, but once installing a large GPU, AIO tube length may be an issue. But when in the 5-slot MATX layout, the motherboard now drops down, with top clearance now becoming roughly 17mm, giving enough room for top-mounted 360 all-in-one coolers. Now down to the nitty gritty, radiator and fan support. First off, for fan support only, the Mini can handle 3 120 or 2 140s at the bottom, 3 120 or 2 140s at the top, 2 120 or 2 140s on the side, and a single 120 at the rear. Yep, that's a total of 9 fans if going for an all-out air-cooled build. For radiator support, I'll cover each layout separately and the support each one can do, but first a huge shout out to EK Waterblocks for supporting all the testing hardware for this coverage. Although the case has 3 distinct motherboard configurations, this doesn't just mean there are 3 final configurations, there are actually 6 all up. As for example, the ATX 7-slot layout, it can also take MATX or MITX motherboards, and for the MHX 5-slot layout, it can also take MITX motherboards. I'll be testing all configurations with EK, XE, PE or SE radiators. When a radiator is used in conjunction with a clearance measure, I'll label the said radiator on screen. I've decided to go with EK radiators as they are one of the most common and slightly wider than others, especially the XE and PE series. For all the layouts, I will be using a reference RTX 2080 Ti with the standard EK Vector water block. Starting off with config 1, standard 7-slot ATX layout, I'll also group config 2 7-slot MATX and config 3 7-slot ITX with this, as all the radiator clearances don't really change. At the top we have only 25mm of clearance, which is really for fans only. Even running radiators down past memory modules or VRM heatsinks is a no-go. For the bottom of the chassis, there is 120mm to the bottom of the GPU for up to a 360mm radiator. This is the same if using an ATX, MATX or ITX motherboard in this layout, as radiators can extend up past the motherboard. Boards using the very first PCI slot will give you a fraction more room here. Lian Li does state that 280mm radiators are not recommended when using an ATX motherboard, but when testing I had no issues with clearances here. An EK SE280 is the same width as the one shown. Side support can handle 240 or 280mm radiators like mentioned before. Side radiator clearance in the back chamber of the Mini is 35mm, and this will stay the same in all configurations. One thing to mention, if you want to feed your radiator ports from the main section to the back section, I was unable to do this with my EK rads. The ports just didn't clear the opening. This can easily be fixed with a Dremel. If going with something like a 240 FLT style pump res combo or 2 120s for some dual loop action, only a DDC version will allow the pump to fit in the rear chamber. DDCs with heatsinks do fit as well. If going with the D5, you'll have to extend the FLT out a bit more into the main section. Clearance in the main chamber will depend on either your GPU and other radiators. I've already covered fitment with long GPUs above, but if using a shorter GPU, no longer than 277mm and no other radiators top or bottom, then radiator thickness here is basically unlimited. If using a bottom or top 360mm radiator, clearance for the side here is 86mm. Here I was able to fit an EK-XE240 and an EK-XE360. Crazy. And remember, all these measurements for the 7-slot layout will stay the same if using an MATX or ITX motherboard. I also found side and radiator fan clearance stay the same for all 6 configurations at 86mm in the main chamber. Jumping to config 4, as config 2 and 3 were covered above, this is 5-slot MATX layout. Config 4 and further configs see the elimination of ATX motherboards. I'll actually group this with config 5 as well, which is the same layout but with MITX motherboards, as all clearances stay the same, just the motherboard changes. This is our first config so far that sees us remove one PCI module, dropping from 7 slots down to 5, thus allowing slightly more room above the motherboard tray. Here, the top now has roughly 65mm of clearance for up to a 360 or 280mm radiator and fans. Bottom clearance is now up to 100mm to the bottom of the GPU. Once again, side clearances stay the same as previous. In this setup, I was able to fit an EK-PE360 at the top, EK-XE360 at the bottom, and an EK-PE240 on the side. I could have swapped the side with an XE240 with fans in the rear chamber as another option. These measurements will all stay the same if using an MITX motherboard instead of an MATX board. Config 6 3-slot MITX layout, and the last layout we'll be checking out is the sole MITX config. Here we see the back panel drop down again and another PCI module removed. This drops the motherboard down even lower than previous. At the top, we now have roughly 105mm of clearance to the DIMM slots for up to a 360 or 280mm radiator and fans. Clearance at the bottom is 65mm to the GPU for up to a 360 or 280mm radiator and fans. I was able to fit an EK PE360 at the bottom with fans, but it was super tight, and good luck getting those bottom stop fittings in. An EK SE360 is a much better fit down here, while I had no issues fitting an EK XE360 with fans at the top. Once again, side clearances stayed the same as previously, being 3-slot MITX DTX motherboards are supported as well. Lian Li have included 3 different types of pump stands: flat, elevated, and floating. The flat pump stand is a low profile pump mount that allows you to install a pump directly to the bottom of the chassis. The elevated pump stand is designed to raise the pump slightly higher than the radiator. Unlike the flat mount, which was fixed in one position, the elevated pump stand can slide left or right. This mount is meant to eliminate any ports being blocked on the pump top by the radiator. And finally is the floating pump stand, which attaches directly to a 120mm fan, which allows the pump to go above the radiator and fans. This mount has some slight adjustability left or right. All 3 pump mounts conform to standard DDC hole spacing. There is no D5 support from what I can see, but in saying that, a DDC would be the best option for this chassis. Now that's most of the case covered there. I am doing 3 separate builds in this chassis. I'm doing an ATX, an MATX, and an ITX. So I have completed the ITX build already, so let's check it out. Now I have done a full time-lapse build on this rig, and I'll probably drop that a few days after this video goes live. Now I won't cover too much on this rig in this video, only because I am doing 2 more time-lapse builds on the MATX one and then the ATX one, and I think I'll do a final video of all 3. I'll go over the hardware and any issues I had with the builds, because I mainly think the ATX one will probably be the hardest one to fully custom water cool, mainly because I want to do a dual loop in that system. So yeah, I'll cover all those builds there, because this one is a bit of a beast. It is a 5950X running an RTX 3090 in an ITX form factor. But in saying that, I don't think I will do a build in the true ITX layout, which is the 3-slot, which was the last config, which was number 6 you saw earlier in this review. This one here is using the MATX layout with an ITX motherboard, only because it gave me slightly more room at the bottom, a little bit less at the top, whereas if I go with the true ITX layout, config 6, it gives you less room at the bottom, but more at the top, and I think for this type of build, it worked out better this way. Now, if you're looking at fitting a pump res combo in the back, I haven't really covered that too much. I only talked about flat reses in the main side section. You can actually fit a DDC under the power supply. So if you want a DDC with a small res, that does fit in there, and you can have it out of sight, and you can have your tubes run from around the side into the side bit and around the back. Now, the feet do have little slits in them to install your radiators. A lot of cases these days, when there is a bottom mount radiator, you do often have to unscrew the plastic feet to screw in the radiator. Now, in saying that, it's only the screw holes at the very start and the very end of your radiator. You do have full access on all the others, but it is nice they have added just a little groove in there to allow you to put your screwdriver in and screw that radiator in. Now, one thing I really do like is there is now a gap between the feet at the front, so you can naturally pick this case up like you do with most cases without having to grab it from the sides, because I know it's not really an issue, but it's been something that's been brought up a lot. When you have your feet run all the way across the front, you can't get your hand under as a handle to carry the case around. Now, one thing you may have noticed from when this was originally announced is there was a OLED screen that was sort of on the front down the bottom. I reached out to Lian Li about this. This has been removed. This was purely a cost-cutting feature because it was going to sort of bloat out the cost too much of the chassis, because these little OLED screens aren't cheap. The ones I use in my builds, they're a little bit bigger, but they can still cost up to $800 for those screens. Now, that moves over to the price. This case comes out at just $99. So you could imagine putting in like a $50 screen, having to hook that up to the whole system. It's probably going to nearly double the price of the case. So $99 for both versions, and then 159 Australian for the Aussie guys as well. So that's a pretty good deal for what you're getting in this chassis. It's not the biggest case around, but in saying that, people think that ITX cases, when you go small form factor, it should be cheaper, but technically I think it is the opposite. Once you start going smaller, things start to cost more. Now, lastly, I want to cover availability. I just reached out to Lian Li about this, and they do reckon early December we should start seeing these in stores. And for our Aussie folks, I've been told PC Case Gear is the sole or the main retailer for this chassis. So overall, I was very, very pleased with the O11 Mini. Now, I have only done the MITX build so far, but during that build, I had no issues at all whatsoever. And also during my review process, I think I've swapped this back panel probably at least 50 or so times during that review, and I had no issues with stripping the screws, no issues with moving the motherboard standoffs, because you have to move them for every time you move down a different configuration, and then when you go back up to another configuration, you have to change them again. So I had no issues there. I guess once I complete the MATX layout, then do the ATX build, I will have a better understanding on those for that. But yeah, if you are looking at picking up this case, I would get in early, because I think this is going to be very, very hot, and probably no doubt you're going to see a lot of YouTubers probably say that this is probably their case for 2020. Now, I'm pretty sure Lian Li took that out last year, and I have a feeling they're going to take it out this year. But anyway, thanks again. I want to thank Lian Li for sending me these to check out. I will have the 3 builds up shortly, and I want to thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned for next time.